2.
Can you hear me now?
Good.
Too loud, too soft? All right. You know, it's kind of a blessing to be able to be here and teach and share with you from God's Word. I know that you have received some great teaching from some great teachers in the past. This place has been a very blessed place. Brother Hall, Billy Jack, and I don't even know who came before them, but I can tell that there's been some great teachers here. And it is a blessing and an opportunity to share from Ruth, because it is such a rich, deep, and powerful book in God's Word. Only 4 chapters, very small, but so packed with power, and so relevant to our lives. Last time that I taught, which was quite a while back, I talked about God has a plan. And we need to know that. We need to be assured of that on a constant, regular basis. But there's something that we can do that can help us stay in touch with God has a plan. If we don't have a heart, if we don't have a mind that's focused on what I call the big picture. I mean, there's a lot of people have their ideas of what the big picture is. You talk to them about sports, they have a certain perspective of what the big picture is. But when we talk about God, we need to keep that big picture in focus. And the times when we need to have that in focus more than any other is when we are struggling with life. And for some people, that's their whole life, is a struggle. And when we keep that big picture, sometimes it helps us in the midst of the pit. You know, when you're in a pit, you've got all these walls around you. You can't see anything outside of those walls. The only place you can look is up and really see anything. But when we're in the pit, we have this tendency to have an enemy who is pounding on us from every direction. And he is bound and determined to keep us from looking up. And when we are busy trying to dodge punches and evade swings from the enemy, it's hard to look up. It would be kind of unfair for me to say, oh, well, your only problem is you just need to look up to God. He's got an answer. Because the person who's in the pit right now is so distracted by what's happening around them that they can't look up. It's hard for them to look up. And I think sometimes, we need to take the Bible and look at it and draw it into our situations in life a lot more than what we do. I'm going to do that today to introduce and bring us into where I want to talk about in Ruth, the 2nd chapter, the end, because we're going to finish that. We're going from God has a plan now, and we're stepping into the big picture. And in order to get that big picture, I think we have to take a little different perspective than what we normally take. So I'm going to kind of take Job's approach and embellish that into a story and bring it into Ruth. Now, God didn't give me some kind of a vision. He didn't say, oh, Steve, this is what happened in heaven. This is a story, okay? I'm making this up. So don't get the wrong impression. But just imagine, if we saw things from God's perspective, what would that really look like? So I'm going to kind of go with a story today, and it's kind of going to go something like this. Imagine the great throne room of heaven, the great hall in which God sits in. Imagine the throne upon which he is seated, and the angelic hosts seated around the room. And in the midst of the hall is the great sea of humanity. And God is observing that sea of humanity, and he is watching what is happening in the midst. This is the time in which Elimelech, Boaz, Naomi are living. It is the period of the judges, a time in which the people are on the roller coaster of life. One minute a judge comes in and they're drawn to God, and then the judge is gone and they're back doing their own thing. As a matter of fact, the scriptures say an interesting comment about that in Judges 3:7. I'm picking just 2 verses, but this is kind of like the perspective of the way things are going on, how things are happening. The Israelites did what was evil in the Lord's sight. They forgot the Lord, their God, and worshiped the Baals and Asherahs. That's Judges 3:7. Judges 17:6 says this: In those days there was no king in Israel, but every man did that which was right in his own eyes. Now that's kind of hard to imagine. Everyone doing what they think is right in their own eyes. I mean, to some extent, we're used to structure around us. We're used to, you can't drive over 30 miles per hour in town, and you can't do this, you can't do that, or here's the best way to do this. But every man is doing what is right in his own eyes. And so Satan all of a sudden appears in heaven before the throne of God, and he says, Father, I've been down running around in your promised land. I've been keeping track of your people, Father. I want you to know what it's like down there. They're all doing their own thing. So, Father, I want you to think about this for a minute. But I bet you, Father, if you were to bring a famine on that land, those people would turn their backs on you. And God stops and he looks about the throne room, and he looks down at Satan, and he acquiesces to Satan's request. Satan probably figures, I have God now. I've got him exactly where I want him. And so Satan brings that famine upon the land, and sure enough, Elimelech, God is my king, grabs his family, including Naomi, Pleasant, and drags them from the promised land to Moab. He takes his family from the promised land and enters the world. Satan's got to be looking at this and saying, oh, I've got you now, God. This is your kingly line. This is your messianic line. And I have brought them into the world. And as time progresses, Elimelech, God is my king, passes away. In the world. In Satan's domain, he passes away. Satan's smiling now. He has got God right where he wants him. And sure enough, the children of God is my king pass away too. Satan's got to be smug right now. He's in control. The messianic line, the kingly line, is ended. As I said last time I taught, that God has a plan. God has a plan, and there is a big picture. This Naomi, who was pleasant, all of a sudden decides she is going to return to the promised land. She is taking a step in the right direction. She has made a choice, a decision, drawing her home where she belongs. Sometimes we find ourselves so deep in the pit that we can't see any other recourse. But Naomi is no longer Naomi. She is now Mara. She is bitter. And she tries to force her daughter-in-laws to return back to their homelands. And Orpah says, no, I won't do that. But as Naomi continues to push, she caves in. And she goes back to her homeland, back into the world. But Ruth, this Moabitess young lady, clings to Naomi and says, no, I will not return back into the world. As a matter of fact, I choose your God. I choose your people. I choose you over my home. Now, this is no big loss to Satan. He's already defeated the messianic line. He's already ended the kingly line. But still, it's kind of disheartening to think that he couldn't keep Naomi in his world. And it is a little disconcerting that one of his people, one of his children, would become a proselyte of this God whose people in his land are doing their own thing. But Ruth, this new proselyte, gets up one day and says to Naomi, I am going to go out and glean in the fields and bring us home some food. And Naomi is sitting back in her bitterness, and she is probably thinking, you go ahead, but I'm going to sit here and wait for the inevitable and just starve. And we could take that mindset very easily in life, in the midst of our bitterness, in the midst of our turmoil. It's a very easy position to go to, and it's a very sad position to be at. But we can choose that. But this young lady, Ruth, goes out into the fields to glean, a humbling, poverty-stricken individual who at home is suffering with a mother-in-law who is in the depths of depression. But you see, she is walking into God's plan. She is stepping out and doing something that is God's will for those who are poor. It's there in His law. That those who need should be able to come and glean about the fields of those who have. That's God's law. And so she has decided to step out into that and to live that life. But as I said, there is a big picture here. Sometimes we forget that there are things going on that we do not see. That there is a bigger picture than what I know. And sometimes the simplest thing to do, the right thing to do, is to simply step out in faith and do what God tells us to do. This brings us to a point where I want to stop and look at a special person. This person's name is Boaz. He is an unusual character for us to look at because of everything that I've said so far. He does not seem to be one of those people who is on this roller coaster. He is not under the thumb of Satan. He's not caught in the snares of the evil one. But he is directed by God's love and law. Let me read Ruth 2, 8 through 23. Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Listen, my daughter, don't go and gather grain in another field, and don't leave this one, but stay here close to my young women. See which field they are harvesting, and follow them. Haven't I ordered the young men not to touch you? When you are thirsty, go and drink from the jars the young men have filled." She bowed with her face to the ground and said to him, "Why are you so kind to notice me, although I am a foreigner?" Boaz answered her, "Everything you have done for your mother-in-law since your husband's death has been fully reported to me. How you left your father and mother and the land of your birth, and how you came to a people you did not previously know. May the Lord reward you for what you have done. May you receive a full reward from the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge." "My Lord," she said, "you have been so kind to me, for you have comforted and encouraged your slave, although I am not like one of your female servants." At mealtime, Boaz told her, "Come over here and have some bread and dip it in the vinegar sauce." So she sat beside the harvesters, and he offered her roasted grain. She ate and was satisfied and had some left over. When she got up to gather grain, Boaz ordered his young men, "Be sure to let her gather grain among the bundles, and don't humiliate her. Pull out some stalks from the bundles for her and leave them for her to gather. Don't rebuke her." So Ruth gathered grain in the field until evening. She beat out what she had gathered, and it was about 26 quarts of barley. She picked up the grain and went into the city, where her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. Then she brought out what she had left over from her meal and gave it to her. Then her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you gather barley today? And where did you work? May the Lord bless the man who noticed you." Ruth told her mother-in-law about the men she had worked with, and said, "The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz." Then Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed by the Lord, who has not forsaken his kindness to the living or the dead." Naomi continued, "This man is a close relative. He is one of our family redeemers. Ruth the Moabitess said, "He also told me, 'Stay with my young men until they have finished all of my harvest.' So Naomi said to her daughter-in-law Ruth, 'My daughter, it is good for you to work with his young women, so that nothing will happen to you in another field.' Ruth stayed close to Boaz's young women and gathered grain until the barley and the wheat harvests were finished. And she lived with her mother-in-law." A lot of people, a lot of scholars that I've read, a lot of people that I know, interpret Boaz as a type of Christ. A person who represents Christ in this world, kind of reflection of who Christ is. And in some ways we can see that. Of course, none of us are a perfect representation of Christ. We all fail. Boaz, I'm sure, had some failings. But they're not brought out in this story, which is kind of interesting. Because the Bible tends to be pretty honest. But Boaz has instructed Naomi, or Ruth, rather, to stay close to his crew that's working the fields. He's instructed her to follow them where they go. So he has already taken a step of helping this poor, poverty-stricken young lady by doing good for her. And so one of the aspects of the kinsman redeemer is that they must be first and foremost a blood relative. And we're told in Ruth, the 2nd chapter, the 1st verse, that Boaz is a close relative of Elimelech. So we already know that this man, even though Ruth does not know, even though she just happens to walk into his field, that he is a close relative. Ruth doesn't know this. She just happens on this field. Happens. Right. Happens. No, we're talking about providence here. God is at work. There is a bigger picture. God's plan is in place and it is moving forward. It's not some simple off-the-cuff thing that's happening here. This is God at work. Big time. Big picture. You know, the thing about a big picture is this. People who think in the big picture are never concerned about what is. The thing that they are focused on is what can be. That's big picture thinking. We're taking into account here what God can do. And God is moving. So the first aspect of the kinsman redeemer, relative of blood, he fulfills that. The second aspect of the kinsman redeemer is that they have to be able to redeem the person who is their blood. Now here's the thing. Ruth walks into this field. Look at some of the things that are happening here. He's not just allowing her to glean around the edges. He's allowing her into his field. The law doesn't say that he has to do that. The law says he has to allow her to glean the edges. But in the scripture we read, Boaz is allowing her into the field. Not only is he allowing her into the field, but look what he does. He allows her to sit at his crew's table. The people who are gleaning the field for him. And he is sharing their food with her. And, you know, when it says he gave her enough that she had left over, and she puts that aside, I bet that wasn't just for her that there was left over. I would imagine that his whole crew was receiving a little extra so that they had something to take home too. This is the kind of character of the man that God is using in this story. He's a step above. He's beyond. And in the big picture, he's available for God to use. You know, sometimes it's more important to be available than anything else. It's not just a matter of being capable. It's are we able and available? So we find that Boaz not just fulfills that first part, being a close kin, but he's going out of his way to make provision extra. I would say he's pretty able. He's got a crew that goes out and gleans his field. He seems to give extra to them. And now it appears he's allowing her to go out into his field and glean as well as his workers. And not only that, he's going a step farther. He's told his workers, don't humiliate her for being in the field. Don't rebuke her in her poverty, but take a little bit of extra out of the standing grain and drop it in front of her so she can pick it up. This is a man of abundance. He is able. And boy, I tell you what, it sure seems like he's willing, doesn't it? And willingness, that is the third aspect to fulfill the kinsman redeemer role. I think sometimes we need a little push from God to remind us of how good and great He is. Sometimes we need just a little picture that pops out and says, hey, this is what's going on. Consider this. Naomi could have decided not to return to the promised land. Ruth could have decided not to go with Naomi. Ruth could have decided to sit in the house with Naomi or wherever they were at and commiserated with her suffering. All these things could have been. You know, it's funny. Satan had to be sitting there scratching his head going, well, this isn't quite working out the way I had planned for it to go. This doesn't look like what I wanted things to do. I mean, she had to go out and run into Boaz, that no-gooder that I can't seem to get under my thumb. She had to run into that field. It is important for us as Christians to remember a simple fact. Sometimes the most unlikely person making the most insignificant decision, because this is about decisions, right? The most unlikely person, the most unlikely decision, or most insignificant decision or event, at the most unmomentous moment in time, could be the biggest impact of the history of mankind. Ruth, a Moabitess, deciding to become one of God's people. at a time in history when God's people are on a roller coaster. The line of King David, crushed. The line of Christ, ended. But now, God is going to do a great work. And when we had talked about in the very first session the genealogy of Christ, consider all of the things that could have gone wrong and how Satan could have won this battle. But he lost. And so here we sit today in the midst of a great cloud of witnesses who's gone before. In the midst of a great cloud of witnesses who exist today. So we sit, rejoicing in the work of God. Now, Ruth has been kind of the focus of our story so far. And it's an amazing work that God has done in her life. I brought up Boaz, who, wow, what a story he is, right? But look at the impact on Naomi. This person who is caught in bitterness, who has gone from being pleasant to bitter, is sitting in her home distraught. And in walks Ruth, carrying a bag of grain, almost as big as she is. And what does Naomi respond with? Where on earth did you get that? This is, oh wow, eye-opening. Wake up. God is at work. This isn't just some simple person in poverty going out and gleaning the edges of a field. This is something bigger. This is something huge. This is momentous. Where on earth did you get that? You know, God's abundance is so much greater than anything we could dream of. His provision, His care is beyond anything we could ever imagine. And here is this bitter person all of a sudden having a spark of the Spirit of God awakening in her life as she watches this new believer, this person who really didn't even know what they were doing, come home blessed by God beyond their imagination. It is incredible. This is why we who have been Christians for so long need these new believers, because they make mistakes and God takes all kinds of power and does all these incredible works in their lives. And it reminds us of God. It reminds us of His provision. It reminds us of His care. It reminds us of His love for us. And it can lift us from despair. It can take us from the depths of the pit to the heights of heaven. I hope we're able to continue this study at different times in Ruth, because I really, it is a wow story. The truths that God expresses from Ruth are unbelievable. And there is so much to it. We could spend a year on it easy, I'm sure. But we need to have that focus when we are in the pit of the big picture. All these things that are going on around us that are buffeting us, all these little trials and tribulations, God gets us to the other side. God gets us to the other side. And one day, we wake up in heaven, in His presence. I don't know where you're at today. I don't know if you're troubled, if you're in despair. I don't know if you're suffering. But I will tell you this. God cares. Don't give up. Just keep doing what He tells you to do. And you will get to the other side. It will happen. Look at Ruth's responses to Boaz. She bows with her face to the ground and says to him, "Why are you so kind to notice me, although I am a foreigner?" "My Lord," she said, "you have been so kind to me, for you have comforted and encouraged your slave, although I am not like one of your female servants." There are three aspects of the kinsman redeemer. The first aspect that I would like to mention is redeeming the name. And that is stepping in and providing a child to carry on the name of a family. The second is redeeming the land, stepping in and redeeming the land, the debt that is owed on it. The third aspect is the avenger of blood. When someone is killed, standing up and going out after the killer. Boaz completes two of those aspects in our story. Jesus Christ completes all three. If you have needs today, I'd like to invite you to come forward. If you don't know Jesus Christ, come and meet Him. If you have needs today and don't want to come forward, stop and talk to your brothers and sisters today and get their help. Jim, could you lead us in a song of invitation?
Please stand.